And good evening and welcome to our exaflicks panel discussion for this month's movie, which is WarGames. Shortly, I'm going to be asking our panelists to introduce themselves. And what I will do as well, I'll give them some time to think about this because I'm going to mention a few other things. I'm going to ask them, they could tell us their name, which is appearing on the screen, but won't be in the recording. A little bit about their role, like maybe why WarGames is of interest to them. But if there was a special scene in the film or a quote that you would say is one of your favorites, and we may come back and discuss that particular one in a little bit. Now, before we do that, just a couple of things I want to, mention. So we did this a few weeks ago, but we watched Hidden Figures. That's the film about the three Black African-American ladies who worked in NASA. And it's a beautiful film. It's really, really worth watching. It does have a few bits of truth that are stretched to make it watchable. But it's on, if you're in the UK, it's on Film for tomorrow night. That's Thursday at 9 p.m. It frequently appears on that channel. But we have recorded the panel discussion from last month. So you might, if you're watching the film, you haven't seen it, you might want to watch that as an accompaniment. Something else to mention as well. Next month, the plan is to watch The Social Dilemma. So we'll probably be watching that in mid-November. I think it'll be the 18th, but I'll send some details out about that later. So, Nikki, would you mind switching your camera off for now? And I'm going to ask now, if I just introduce our panelists in this order. So as I'm looking, I can see Josh is on my left. Nancy is on, I'm trying to do this in a mirror way, it's hard, on the other side. And we have Kerry, Martin, and Claire. And if everybody else who's in the audience could keep their microphones muted and cameras and use the chat to interact. So, Josh, if you wouldn't mind starting, Nancy, Kerry, Martin, and Claire. Who are you and why are you here? And tell us about your favorite part of the film.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm Josh. I'm 16 and I am a software developer apprentice in the day, and then when I'm not doing that, I develop exaflicks, which is a drag and drop tool for creating Python programs. My favorite part of the film, I've only seen it about 2 hours ago. I started watching it, but favorite part was probably seeing how easy it was to be able to break into something so critical. I'll talk about it more in the panel, but it was quite interesting to see, like, you know, how a film in 1983, how it kind of plays into today's world, how they predicted quite a lot of things. So that was quite interesting. But yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Josh. Nancy?
Hello, everyone. It's really great to be here. Alan and I met under odd circumstances. I'll let him tell about. And so it's great to actually to be here. So I have watched the film at a couple of different times, and then I watched it again last weekend. And I really found it to be still really fresh and engaging. I enjoyed it much more than I expected to, frankly. So it was really good to watch, and I look forward to the discussion here. I was really struck by the theme of education and compliance in a way that I hadn't sort of focused on before. And then the part that really struck me that I'd be excited to talk further about is you know, what would be contemporary for today, or what would be new today. And one of the things I wanted to throw out now is the spatial paradigm. I am a new radio operator, and I think that, you know, even Falcon on the island, when he's flying drone pterodactyls, basically, and the fact that the movie opens with someone driving and everything is driving, and the Matthew Broderick character can't swim off an island, and yet he comes in with a helicopter. So the kind of, you know, spatial aspect of a future is something that interested me. I'll send it over to back to Alan.
And Kerry?
Hi, I'm Kerry Harrison. I'm the lead for the Lancashire Digital Skills Partnership, which is part of the Lancashire Enterprise Partnership, and we look at bringing together and convening groups of people from public, private and charity sector organisations to address digital skills needs and problems in the county. When Alan told me that this was happening, I was like, this is like one of my favourite films of the 80s, without a doubt. We had a quiz through work, you know, the millions of quizzes that everybody's had during lockdown, and one of them was to dress as your favourite 80s character, and I dressed as the character. Well, actually, I decided I wanted to dress as the male character because he was the more sort of technically savvy and all the rest of it. And I must admit, I don't like how they kind of played her as a bit of a, I don't know, a ditz really, that she asked quite lots of silly questions, and that really annoyed me, but which I never really noticed previously. But with that said, I think my favourite part of it is definitely the in the bedroom bit with all this tech set up and seeing all that tech as it was in the 1980s, and just and I can remember as a kid watching that, and it absolutely definitely influenced my GCSE choices, because I kind of was like, oh, I want to be that person who can do that kind of coding and do that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's my thought from that really.
And I remember, Kerry, when I mentioned, oh, we're going to be watching WarGames, you went, oh, I've totally got to be on the panel. And it surprised me a little bit, because WarGames was never one that I kind of rated highly before today. But Martin, it's a special one for you, WarGames.
It's my fault we were watching WarGames, yes. So invited me on to be on a panel and asked me what we should talk about. And I suggested WarGames because it's an awesome film, basically. So I'm a computer science university lecturer. So I watched this film as a kid, and it probably did influence me into what I was going to be. I guess similar to Kerry, the tech in the bedroom was like awesome when I was a kid. But rewatching it as an adult, it's some of the stuff that they predicted. So there's a bit towards the end when they are trying to get access to Joshua again. So he's doing the nuclear launch codes, he's trying to work it out. And there's just a throwaway line where they say, we can't get past the firewall, which was a film released in 1983. Computer firewalls were invented in the late 80s. So it wasn't actually a thing back then. And there's some suspicion that computer firewalls were actually named after that film and the use in that film, which I think is just kind of cool.
We'll come back to this later, because there are some kind of premonitions or future forecasting in the film. And I only the other night listened to the audio commentary, and it's interesting to listen to the two writers and the director at the time, and they're saying, people said, how did you know that these things were going to come true? And they said, well, we didn't. We just, imagined what if, Claire, you also, like Kerry, you said, oh, Alan, WarGames, I've totally got to be there.
Yeah, I turned up to this film quite later on in life. Probably when I first started being a teacher, it's something that I showed for like activities week. So I've been a teacher for 6 years, and I'm really into esports at the moment. I do plug that with my students at my school. Again, Martin kind of took my quote really from the film, the fact of the firewall and being able to just using the technology that you've got in your own home, and then suddenly you're into another world. And I kind of use those types of analogies and things in school, in my classroom, and use sort of after school clubs to get the kids into a lot more activities like cyber discovery and things like that that can link with the film as well, and skills that they've picked up.
Great. So I have a long list of questions, which we're not going to go through all of them, but they'll just help us kind of navigate through the messages, the high points and the low points, and some of the tech in the film. The film has an interesting mix of characters, and I wonder if we could just have a discussion about some of the characters from it, whether you thought there were certain heroes in the film, whether there were certain people that you yourself might align with, or you might see, the best elements of your character, you might in some of them, or if there was a particular character that you really, really didn't like whatsoever, and you know, if you, it would be the worst thing ever if you had to work with that person. So anybody want to name any characters in the film that stood out for them?
Well, the general would be absolutely at the top of my list of misogynists that I can't possibly work with. Absolutely, he played that character well. I thought what was quite funny to me watching it after quite a while is I really felt in the 80s they mustn't have had that many actors, because they seemed to, I was like, oh yeah, you were in Top Gun and you were in and you were in and you were in, and I was just like, oh, that's interesting. I'd not really thought about it before, but yeah, he definitely wouldn't be. And why would you want to identify with Matthew Broderick and just be, you know, David and all those skills and be the skillful one?
We'll go back to David in a moment. So you mentioned General Beringer. I'd want to say Beringer, but they say Beringer in the film. And the film itself has a PG classification. And I'm watching it again this evening. I think that there are 5, what we'd say, swear words in the film, and they all come out of his mouth. There's the 4-letter that rhymes with hit. He mentions about, he uses another word for urinating on a spark plug. He uses another phrase, you know, BS, quite a lot of stuff, which maybe is meant to sort of, but also he was quite, that actor's quite typecast. If you go on IMDb or something, look, you'll see that there's sort of 10 other films around the same time where he had a very similar role. And so we'll come to David in a moment. Anybody else comment on Beringer? Was it necessary to have a character like that in the film, do you think? Okay, right. Well, David. Okay, so Kerry, you mentioned David. Do you want to expand on David, or somebody else want to pick up?
I was jumping in there
as an American and just say that I felt like, although he was typecast, I think that there was remarkable diversity in the film, frankly, for an American film. I thought the women were wide ranging. So I thought that although there was a typecast for everyone really, but I thought it was broader than typically American. So
yeah, I'd say they've almost, my impression was it was almost balanced in a way, because there's Jennifer, who Kerry said comes across as really ditzy, and you know, she talks about she's part of a keep fit group, and she's like, oh, all these flashy lights.
Jennifer's effectively an audience substitute, though.
Yeah.
So part of her character is there so that there's somebody to explain to, and it has to be someone that David would interact with, or else you're just going to see him sat in his bedroom, and you've no idea what he's doing.
The line that really got me was the one when, well, there's 2 lines that really got me that were hers, which were one when the code, basically she asked what a launch code was and why you'd need a launch code.
Yeah.
And I just felt that was completely superfluous. And actually the other 2 characters didn't even answer the question. They just kind of moved on. And it was just like,
there was a bit, I think, like a little bit after that where I think it was David was trying stuff. And everybody's like, no, stop him from doing that. And it was Jennifer who'd said, no, let him try again. And they went, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's this general just going, yes, a school student's fine. Yeah, do what she says.
The line that really got me that was hers was when she went, oh yeah, 41, that's really old.
Yes.
Like, oh my gosh. I'm well past that now.
So picking up, we're talking about characters. Anybody think David is the hero of the film? No. Okay.
I'm not convinced there really is a hero. There isn't really one character that is. Nikki says Joshua's the hero. I don't think there's really one character. Just going to follow the chat. That's really a hero in this. It's kind of a set of people that do stuff.
It's teamwork.
Yeah, I think everyone had their own part to play in the, reaching the end of it. I don't think there was one standout person that, did it all to me.
No, I'd agree with that.
When I think about the education piece, I did realize that everybody is really being forced to comply, even with the scene where the garbage trash it knocks over and the parents yell at him to come pick it up. that I just realized that really every single aspect of this movie is not only about education, but really about how do you get people to comply, or the impossibility of having them comply. So in a sense, it's really the anti-hero is everyone not complying, like how people respond to avoiding compliance is an interesting, sort of theme. And what is the point of education, really? So I thought it was kind of an interesting riff on education at every single scene, which I hadn't picked up before.
I really liked the juxtaposition between him failing his biology and clearly not applying himself very well, and then actually just something he's interested in and he can see a purpose, absolute 100% application. And that to me kind of sums up what we should be doing with our education system, and where we miss sometimes very badly with what we're forced to teach, not necessarily what we want, have to, or want to teach.
Yeah, there's an interesting point there. So Nancy and I, yes, we did meet in some unusual circumstances, something to do with the NSA, but I can't really go into a lot more detail
Yes,
at this
you
point.
can.
But Nancy and I were talking about this film, WarGames, a while ago. I said, my friend Martin's chosen this film. And then Kerry and Claire are like, yeah, it's a great film. And I'm not so convinced. And Nancy was saying, well, if you look at the transformation that Matthew's character goes through, so he kind of fits in at school, but doesn't academically. And, he struggles, but he does have talents. And then I started thinking, it reminds me a little bit of somebody I know. Josh, you don't know who I'm talking about, do you?
No, I don't know.
You don't know anybody who sometimes struggled to fit in a little bit in school and didn't necessarily get the academic grades, but yet in other ways is achieving fantastic things that adults think is amazing.
I focused on the things that I liked, and then didn't on the things that I didn't like, which was kind of my problem. So I guess I can kind of relate that to the film. But yeah, it was interesting to see, like, I think what I found weird is that they stored grades on a computer in 1983. Like that was
and
pretty...
connected to a phone line as well.
Yeah. So a lot of it was very forward thinking, that I found. And it was quite I was saying to Alan earlier, like the film actually is really held up well. If you didn't tell someone the year that it was made in, I don't think anyone would really be able to say 1983 if they didn't know the year, which was pretty interesting. You look at films like Back to the Future where they predict things, they're kind of a bit like that. So yeah, that was quite interesting.
Claire, games, you mentioned esports. Can you see any parallels between the esports world now and some of the games that the computer, the Whopper or Joshua, as we could call him, were engaging in? Or do you think that's tenuous?
I do think that there is some link. I did read somewhere that even for the part that he had to play that particular game for 2 months, to be particularly for that shot of the film as well. So I do think with the esports we have time to practice and put into our skills for that. I would have, me personally, I would have loved to have seen, sorry, think of the cast member, her name has skipped my mind. I would like to have seen her play more of the games as well.
Jennifer, yeah.
Jennifer, that's it, sorry, I couldn't think of it. And I think that's why I've definitely, from my role in school, I've got, we can do this, and not just males, but trying to get the females playing the computer games as well.
Yeah, so perhaps it's something that the film glossed over a little bit too much. We see a scene of David, he's in a cafe and there's these arcade coin-op machines and he's playing Galaga, and I think there's a little bit of the issue of the dubbing, because the noises don't necessarily correspond with what's going on, but he's getting very, very high scores, and then he realizes he has to go, and there's a younger child, and he says to the younger child, here, you carry on. But there's no sort of, David has spent 2 months with private access to these machines at home, and that's how he's so good. It's just kind of, every computer he touches his hands to is just going to work perfectly, or something like that, which we know is not exactly true. The future scoping. Oh, Kerry, go on.
I was just gonna say, it's like everything he touches, he can like hack it somehow. Like the phone, he go, "I've just got some random metal and I'll hack the phone." And
although he has to go to, I assume it was like a university or something. He ends up with the two guys whose names I cannot remember, to try and get advice from them. So it's not everything he knows; it's just certain bits he's, I assume, been exposed to in the past. So he knows about war dialing. He knows about phone phreaking. Not that it works that way, but he does know about it. I don't think it's everything. And from the arcade bit, I took from that he basically spent every morning before school, A, playing that game, and B, being late for school.
Yeah, definitely.
And look where it got him.
Yes.
I mean,
he got to visit NORAD.
Yes. But not only that, in the end, some people say it's a flaw. He says, "Oh, but nobody wins at tic-tac-toe," which apparently there is one way you can always win if this happens.
No, you can't. No, there's a tactic you can use for tic-tac-toe, which is when you go into one of the top corners.
If the other one doesn't, if the other player doesn't go in the center or something like that.
But it's only if the other player doesn't know you can do that.
Yes. Okay.
Which I used to really annoy with my kids with, because I kept winning at tic-tac-toe and they couldn't work out how.
So as we've said before, it's a little incredible that there's things that are mentioned or shown in the film that then weren't either known about or spoken about or existed, but now since exist. So you mentioned war dialing. Now, apparently, I've read somewhere that war dialing, the phrase didn't exist until it was mentioned in the film. A bit like you said about firewall. Were there other things that you think, gosh, that was amazing that they had that working then, and it wasn't? There was a few others.
Well, I'm pretty sure the war dialing was before that. So that wasn't a thing invented for that film. It was a thing that people did, especially for US at that time, because they were doing the phone phreaking, which is basically getting free long distance calls. I don't know. Do you know the story of Captain Crunch? So, the scene where David basically grounds that earpiece and gets free long distance call, that's based on a thing called phone phreaking. And there was multiple phone systems, but one of the phone systems was a single frequency in band dialing system, which was basically, it used tones within the audible range to A, put phones on hook, take phones off hook, and dial numbers so you could hear them. That frequency was 2600 hertz, around 2600 hertz. The reason why Captain Crunch was a thing is because there was a whistle that came in a box of cereal, Captain Crunch cereal in the US, that was at 2600 hertz. And you could use this toy whistle to get free phone calls in the US in the 80s. I assume the film took license of let's not show that that's how you do it. And just like they've done in other things, is go, there's a different method. It's we ground this thing and it works. But what he did was possible. So the first person that discovered it actually had perfect pitch and whistled down a phone. So I made a joke on Twitter about it. Well, to you, Alan, it wasn't a joke, it was true.
It went over my head.
Yeah, absolutely true. So I said that Alan had mentioned that bit, and he said it is a bit strange. I mentioned, he should have whistled down the phone. Maybe that'd be a bit too freaky. And I misspelt freaky, PH, because it was phone phreaking. Okay. Actual thing.
So Josh, like the phone phreaking, Josh mentioned before, our Josh, not the Josh in the film. Josh mentioned it stood well for its age, but I wonder if children today watching it would just take that such a future scoping as for granted, like the fact that he just dials into his school computer to change his grades. And I don't think in 1983 there was any way anybody could have used a phone to just connect over the internet to their school and hack in, for example. And there are some others, or Am I?
Apparently Matthew Broderick took that skill though and did it in the Ferris Bueller's Day Off with the same system, didn't he?
Except it wasn't the grade he changed. It was his
Well,
attendance record.
So did he use the same password?
I think she stored it in the same place though. That looked familiar.
But to speak to Joshua,
Maybe they just reuse that footage. Just
Nancy.
no, just to speak to Joshua's point about how the hacker seems completely relevant today. I think what's interesting is that we have, as a kind of general population, has caught up to the notion of the hacker and what's really happening with computers. I think it's kind of shockingly recent, actually, that this film might suddenly be seeming believable now. But I think that what does really strike me is what would be forward thinking today, you know, so what would be comparable kinds of films that would be outside of people's awareness that we should be paying attention to as sort of future casting. And, you know, again, I do think the movie touches on a couple of them. I do think a lot about electromagnetic spectrum hacking and things like that. And I think that to go back to Falcon on the island doing the drone flying of pterodactyls and then using a helicopter just as one example. And, you know, just kind of, I did briefly watch the beginning of Amazon's series Upload about doing augmented reality, sort of virtual realities. I think any number of those are going to make the next generations that are even younger than you, Joshua, you know, sort of feel as though augmented reality with Pokemon Go and other things, that's going to be very normal to them. So it'll be interesting, Joshua, to see when you feel old in terms of, you know, what people, you know, younger than you are coming up with. So there's some thoughts I have about that, the sort of post-privacy thing, what happens. There's a lot of screens in the film, and so I do think we're heading towards a time when there won't be screens. And so what about voice and Google Glasses and all those kinds of things? So I'd be curious to hear how people feel this. When will this movie become old? Maybe that's the question. You know, when will it become dated? And certainly the kind of chirpiness of the Matthew Broderick character is not an American character today, let me tell you. So that's and probably not a British character either. So I'd be curious to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think you know, artificial intelligence, which were you know, played quite a big part in the film. You know, that's becoming more normal. You know, everyone has either, well, most people have, you know, some sort of artificial intelligent device, whether that be, you know, a smart assistant on their phone or an Amazon Echo or something like that. So maybe when those sort of things become more prominent in people's lives, and, you know, become more, because the film kind of predicts, you know, machines learning for themselves and figuring things out. So I think maybe when that becomes more prominent, because it's still quite a relatively new thing in terms of how mainstream it is today in everyone's lives. So maybe as that advances into more, you know, advanced technology in the future, maybe that's when it'll start become outdated. But I think it will always stand as a kind of a basic example of how machine learning and AI works. So it might not become outdated in that respect, but certainly as that becomes more mainstream, it might get to that point.
It does play into everybody's fear about AI, doesn't it? And machine learning, that idea that the machine will take over the world kind of thing and destroy the world. That kind of part of it, and that's very much a fear, the fear of now, isn't it? That potentially could happen. So it's one thing having a chatbot that's telling you to try something, but there's another then having, or even Alexa, there's another kind of how far do you go with it and how far. And I remember a conversation I had with a mum from school ages ago, and she was talking about robotics and how robots would take over the world, and she was scared of the Terminator view of life. And it was just like, whoa, you know, let's go back a bit and think about a robot in a factory that's programmed to do a certain thing, even if it's got machine learning to sort of things. That's a very different animal entirely to what AI is and how it's developing at the moment. But yeah, it does play into that fear. Sorry, go on.
There's an actual news article that somebody sent me that I hadn't read that tells that something very close to WarGames did happen, where the operators weren't aware that they were within a simulation and were sort of within seconds almost of launching an attack. And there's an interesting allegory in the film, because at the beginning you see these two operators, and one is just at the point where he has to turn the key and he decides not, and this is intolerable. We can't have 22%, I think it was, they were saying in tests, decided not to do it at the end, whereas a machine would always do that. There's another example as well. I heard that Norway there was some fishing boat or something that caused the effect that somebody over in Russia at the in the 80s thought that there was they were going to be victim of an imminent strike.
So
and they were,
the operator was Stanislav Petrov, the Russian one.
Yes.
Don't think it was a boat. I thought it was some atmospheric conditions.
Okay.
But the thing that's interesting about that story is that he thought it was a nuclear attack, and he decided against it. That was in 1983. So it's the year of this film.
But it didn't.
So the exact thing
didn't come to light until many years
later. Late 90s, when it was declassified and came to light. But there was basically a false alarm via the Russians, very similar to kind of this. It was a technological fault, and they had people, and he just didn't believe it. So in violation of instructions and of protocols that he should have done, he should have launched, and he just didn't. So he's credited as like a man that saved the world, because he just didn't start World War III in the 80s.
Whereas would a machine have just taken it on to the next level because it had been programmed or it had learned to do so?
But that's also a question of authentication. And so not only is this about games, but it's also about decision making and automation, but then also authentication, because, they do send those planes up to check and there's nothing there. And so the whole question of how do you deal with disinformation? How do you deal with authentication? And then I think, again, this whole issue, I was thinking about Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow of 2011. So we've made quite a bit of advances on thinking about cognitive bias, and also education has a lot more options now for self-directed, self-passionate learning than it did before. But I think this issue of the disinformation and how do you deal with authentication remains a really troubling issue, not only from a technical point of view, but even as we become inundated with political messages that are niche directed. I just think the issue of authenticating a shared vision, there's just so many ways in which, it's not just a game, it's really about authentication in general. So I'd be curious to hear what other people, if they were worried about the authentication, disinformation messages that were also sort of hinted at in this film.
I had a discussion with my, sorry.
Claire.
No, you go.
I had a discussion about sort of AI and automation machines with my year 11s just a couple of weeks ago, and they were quite happy with machines to be able to do a specific job, but when they came to any sort of decision making, as in quite sort of high level thinking decisions, they said that that's when they'd like a human to maybe take over. And I said, but with AI, the human is plugging in the information to the AI machine, so it's learning from us, it's learning from the internet as well, and actually gave them an article that was written by an AI machine. I didn't actually tell them it was written by an AI. I wanted them to distinguish whether it was an actual journalist or whether it was a machine, and we got quite a few varied responses from my year 11s as to whether this was real or machine written or not. And they seem to have got stuck on the fact that, well, actually, is it the AI that was making the decisions from what it learned from the internet and from the human, or was it that the human just told it to act like this?
So there's a wide range of stuff that fits under kind of AI. So there has been experiments done with training for things like cancer results. So looking at scans, looking at MRIs, looking at various things, and trying to predict basically medical conditions. And because you can train that AI with way more data than it is possible for a human to have seen in their lifetime, you can get a better result. But there is, do you trust that machine with what you're doing, or do you trust the person? We've also got in the past 10 years, generative adversarial networks, which are neural nets, which can be creative. They can paint pictures. So there's some nice examples where you show them a picture of a person and they will draw an anime version. They'll draw caricatures of people, which has always been a computer be creative. And the answer up until about 10 years ago was no. It just follows instructions. They can now be creative. They can now do stuff that we didn't think they could do. Back, in fact, for decades, so even before the 80s, kind of the 50s, 60s, 70s, etc., birth of computing, there was an idea that we could create true artificial intelligence, and they spent a lot of time thinking that chess was the way to do it. If you got a computer that could play chess, you had cracked artificial intelligence, which is probably where the games idea from this film came from. And we have been on the brink of true artificial intelligence, within 5 or 10 years for about the past 60 years. Whether we will ever get there is debatable. But it's an interesting thing to play with and interesting to think about. If a machine gets better at doing a thing than a person, shouldn't the person go and do something else that they enjoy doing? That's just more interesting to that person. If we have machines that are better at predicting cancer or diagnosing cancer, they get to do that. They can deal with all that data.
So really these panel discussions, we'd be better off just creating 6 avatars to discuss the
no, in 5 or 10 years' time, this is a creative endeavor. Either that or when we've solved chess.
I do worry when we watch films like this, and it prompted by something Josh said earlier, that maybe because we're over a certain age, whether that be 41 or whatever, that we're a little bit obsessed with nostalgia of the film. I mean, Kerry, you said earlier, it informed your GCSE choices. You want to have a bedroom like David's with all of those. I mean, they say at the time they were old computers that David had. They weren't state-of-the-art things. I just worry, should we be looking at more contemporary, if we're going to show them to younger family members, students, should we be choosing more relevant contemporary films? No, Claire. Yeah.
No, I tried this out on my form today. I had a look at when they were born, and there was around 2005, 2006, and we had a little bit of time in form, and actually showed them when Steve Jobs released the first iPhone, and how this was a whole new revolution. The fact that he was taking the Mac with the iPod and using a phone and putting them all together into one, and just seeing him pretty much like market the product before he even released a picture of the phone, it still got them gripped. And they were sort of fascinated to see what the first iPhone looked like, because they're now on, what are we on, sort of 10, 11, 12, I don't know, they too many numbers. But they were still gripped by that presentation, and that was a year after they were born.
My kids today wandered in on me watching the film and were gripped by watching the film for quite some time without wandering off, and were very like, well, what's going on, what's happening? And even though the technology looks, it looks dated, but and that gives us a bit of a that's really interesting. But actually to be able to say, when he pulls out that 5 1/4 inch disc and just go, well, that is, those memory sticks that he's chucking things nowadays, that's, an evolution of that, and to understand it is quite interesting. And they got a bit smaller, and then went into that. I think that's quite important. I just go back to what Nancy says about how would we make it more contemporary. I guess that kind of world of AR and VR moving forward, there is a fake news thing there, isn't there? There's absolutely a kind of, there's lots of fake news around, and there's obviously there's still that Russia America thing around fake news in the elections and interfering with the elections. Well, there's nothing to say, it's not a giant leap to think that if they're going to hack stuff, and you know, there was stuff about them hacking the Olympics and potentially causing disruption there in the news, and there's a storyline that about hacking the nuclear systems of, or the defense systems of America, I don't think is too far-fetched, primarily because we know that that's been hacked and it's been in the news, and we've had people, it's happened before, and it hasn't necessarily been Russians, but that kind of Cold War, it could be China, it could be Russia, I think would still set. But I guess there's an interesting thing to think about. If you had a virtual reality kind of Star Trek holodome or something that was happening, how could you how would that then play into it if someone could hack it and put false images in, and you were relying on that to be the sort of thing that you're making decisions on, and you think because you're seeing it and it's really there, but just in an artificial form, that you'll make an informed decision. It's not a machine making a decision, but actually you're still being conned somehow along the way.
Reminds me a little bit of the film Total Recall, you know, where he's
Mm-hmm.
living in a form of reality, an artificial form, and bits of it start to go wrong. I'm just looking at the time. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes of the recording left. Those of us from an education background, when we've taken part in these with previous films, and we've looked at The Imitation Game and Hidden Figures, it's generally consensus that you wouldn't show a film in its entirety to a class, but what you might do is suggest that your students try to watch the film in its entirety, but then you might bring in a clip, a movie trailer or something like that to highlight maybe a message from the film or a moral to see if it resonates. And I wonder, could each of you, if possible, the next moment, if you could think of whether there was a particular scene in the film that you think has a almost timeless message or moral. And if you want,
can I
go
jump
on,
in
go.
here?
Yeah.
So I'm really struck when Claire was talking about the idea of the Madeleine of Proust. So I am a historian, and I think that it's really great to have critical thinking be a core part of education. And so I would actually it's really fascinating to me that Proust wrote Remembrance of Things Past, you know, after World War I. People always forget that. And yet you start this film and it seems like, oh my God, like what am I reading about this part of France from? So it'd be interesting to kind of compare what Claire was saying about, you know, this is history, but history that's not really strange enough. So maybe to kind of start with Remembrance of Things Past and say, like, look how weird history is. And that looks distant enough. And so if you were going to have the Steve Jobs thing be the Madeleine, so what would be the Madeleine of the WarGames? I love it, you know, so that's what I would say.
Okay, that's a great start there. Any other morals, messages?
Yeah, so I think definitely one that I think is, well, there's two main things. One of them is probably, you know, if you're doing artificial intelligence, definitely that it's a good film to show. There's lots of parts that you can show for that, like, you know, trying to crack the launch code, and then there's a security aspect to it as well. You know, writing passwords down on a piece of paper, you know, just hiding it in a cupboard or whatever. It's not exactly the best idea. But, you know, as we were talking about earlier, you know, the modern ways of securing passwords isn't exactly great either, because if you lose your phone and you've got two-factor authentication, then, you know, you've lost everything. So I think
you don't even have to lose your phone for that to be a problem.
Yeah,
you can clone them.
Yeah, so, you know, there's no 100% secure way to kind of keep everything safe. And also there's the aspect of it, like, you know, computers in the wrong hands, and if they're controlling, you know, mission critical tasks like, you know, nuclear war, it can go wrong in the with the wrong people. So I mean, if you can't show the whole film, there's kind of a few key parts of the bits that I mentioned that you could show. But if you can, I think it's, you know, for a 2-hour film, there's a lot to learn from it. If you can, you know, find the time to do that.
For me, I think I'm going to pick up on what Hannah Bowen's put in the chat. I would say there's some kind of compilation of doing the hacking, starting playing that game, and then seeing it on the news, and then making that leap to go, oh my god, that was that us, and that kind of conversation around it, and then to go on to have the sort of moral, ethical hacking kind of debate about illegal and legal hacking. And I think that would be one of my takes on using some of this film.
I like that. You know, here is some of the legislation that exists nowadays. Which of these has he?
So, it actually influenced US policy. So Reagan saw the film, and after he'd seen it, he asked if it was possible. They got back to him. Generals got back to him and said, "It's not just possible; it's plausible. This could actually happen." And then policy changed.
Mm.
And Martin, your moral or lesson from the film?
So I wouldn't show it to an entire class, because what I actually do is tell them to go and watch it, because I teach adults so they can watch the entire thing. That's fine. When I do it with them, because I'm expecting
they can tell you they have watched it.
yeah. But so I expect them to have, because of the age of these people, that they will have watched other computer-based films and hacking films and all that sort of stuff. And I'm trying to teach them about computer security, and I'm trying to teach them about hacking and how it actually happens. One of the things I like about WarGames is that it's really early on in computer films. It's kind of one of the first where the computers, or the stuff they're doing with the computer, is the main point of it. So they haven't got
a moral or a lesson.
So they haven't got all the, you have to type faster, or you type with two people. So a lot of the ways that the technology is used, a lot of the things they do when they're doing things like the social engineering, that is actually how it's done. It's compressed, but it's how it's done, which is quite nice when you're trying to get people into this stuff to go, this is how it actually works. So
when you say about the social engineering, I wondered, when he's in class and he makes a joke and his teacher says, go out, and then he speaks to somebody who may be an administrator, we don't know, and she goes, oh, you're here again. That made me wonder, is he playing the system so that every day he can go through that routine?
Well, I think it's strongly hinted that he gets in trouble so he can go back and change a grade. And he does that whenever he's failed anything.
And Claire, moral lesson from to be gained?
Again, I link it back to the sort of the computer games and teamwork. You don't have to know everything to be good at something. So, and as long as you bring all your skills together, then you can accomplish something.
And you mentioned esports. I mean, that is so true there, where you have squads of 4 all competing against squads from other towns or cities or wherever they may be. There's one, sorry, if I'm allowed to say, I'm strictly not a panelist, when he's in the infirmary, when he's locked in, and he's in, that really appeals to me, because it's like, how do you get yourself out of this situation? It's not necessarily for me what he does with the recorder and play it. It's the fact that he looks around, what can I use? And he opens a drawer and he goes, all the other drawers are locked. And then he thinks, oh, if I remove this drawer, I can get through to and it was all that sort of, looking for weaknesses, which is perhaps what a hacker may do. Listen, everyone, if it's okay. Oh, go on.
I was just like,
the hacker ethical conversation is so incredibly important, and I feel that so strongly. But I think that if we don't engage the next generations in education in ways to make it be not just about, oh, you're a hacker, this is unethical. I really love Claire's approach about, like, let's build teams about this. Like, how can we use this as a way to inspire people to do that? So I just think that that's this is such a critical time to have to give everybody, especially workers feeling disaffected with the 21st century. You have to give people entryways into how they can participate. It's just incredibly important right now. So thanks, Claire. That was a really inspiring notion. Yes, you don't have to be the best at everything, but it's a team. So that's going to be my takeaway.
So I'm going to pause the recording shortly, and then those who can stay still may remain. But if I could just say thank you very much, everybody, for giving up your time. and the recording is going to stop